Good afternoon, or good morning, depending on when you're listening to this. Today we're going to finish up our introduction to AP Human Geography talking about spatial analysis. This lecture should probably take about 25 minutes to listen to. The two main questions geographers need to ask is where and why. Where usually can be answered by maps, and why usually is how are things laid out, and then how are concepts or ideas diffused. Spatial analysis usually takes a look at looking at maps to try and figure out where things are on the surface of a map and how things are laid out, whether it might be buildings, land masses, things like that. And with spatial analysis, we'll be looking at location, distance, space, accessibility, and spatial interaction. Humans possess a strong sense of place, whether it's that comfortability that you get from your hometown or that urge that people get from just going from place to place because they like to travel so much. Recently we went to Philly on spring break and we really enjoyed the city, but we quickly realized that we were definitely more suburban people or folks that prefer the country over the rush and the hustle of the city. Geographers use, when they're thinking about a place on Earth, it's usually the position that something occupies on Earth. And there are four ways to identify location: the name of the place, the site, the situation, and the mathematical location. When we talk about mathematical location, we're talking about like the longitude and latitude, where you can actually look at it on a map. So place can be defined as a specific point on Earth distinguished by particular characteristics. So it's geographical location, it's the geography around it, and along with place, you have a toponym or a name of a place. And this is a name given to a place on Earth so that it describes it. So it might be named for a person, it could be tied to a religion, particularly, for example, down in California or the Southwest, a lot of places are named after saints that are associated with the Catholic religion because of the heavy Spanish influence dating back to the early part of American history, or up north in Quebec in Canada, again because of the strong Catholic influence. Or you could look at physical features, again named after mountains or rivers, different things like that. If you click on here, the explanation below talks a little bit about Ashburn, but Ashburn originally was named Farmwell Station due to the farm and the big plantation that was in the Ashburn area. But closer to the late 1860s, there was a fire at the Farmwell plantation, and the ash tree burned for about a week. And the post office was looking to rename the post office here in what is now Ashburn because of Farmville down in more of the central part of the state. So they went ahead with Ashburn because the ash tree burned. So that is the lore of how Ashburn actually got its name. We've talked a little bit about site and situation last class, but again, site refers to the actual physical location of an area. So you talk about the terrain, whether it's mountainous or flat or hilly. Is the soil made of dense clay like here in Virginia, up at least here in Northern Virginia, or is it really loose and very rich in nutrients, say more down like the Mississippi Delta? Is there thick vegetation like in the rainforest in Amazon versus more of the jungle-like area in Vietnam? And then are there water sources by? Is it dry like the Sahara Desert, or is it teeming with waterways, say like the river valleys in various parts of the world? Situation, this is more refers to location in regards to other places. So what are the roads nearby? What are the other towns nearby or other physical structures that are close to your location? So you could describe how to get from where your friend is to Briarwoods High School. So if they have never been there, you could say they go to Stonebridge, then you could describe how to get there from Stonebridge. So you point out some landmarks and some roads along the way. And this is an example of Manhattan, how it's changed over time as it's gotten increased from 1650 from the original site to up till 1980, when the Twin Towers and things were built, like on Battery Park, and just not Twin Towers, but Twin Towers, and then more larger areas. Situation is more of the, again, one area in relation to another. So you could obviously help somebody get there, to find themselves where to from unfamiliar place, and also understanding its importance. So one, again, compare it to an unfamiliar area. So for example, if I go to Off the Line Road, take a left at Lowndes County Parkway, and a left at the first light, that would obviously help somebody get to Briarwoods. Many locations are important because they're accessible to other places. Like Singapore is very key because it's a city-state, but because of where it is in Southeast Asia, it is a major shipping area. It's been that way for centuries. So it's very key economically to that area. So those are two different reasons we're situated. All right, so if you see Singapore as an example, it is right at the center of trade coming from Africa and then trade coming from Asia. It's right there at the bottom of Southeast Asia, so it's always been a key trading point for hundreds and hundreds of years. Latitude lines measure the distance from the equator north and south, but they run east and west. Longitude lines refer to the distance of the Earth's surface, and they are measured east and west from the prime meridian, but they go north and south. That's how they actually run. So longitude runs north and south, but they're going to measure the distance east and west of the prime meridian. And latitude lines go east and west, but they measure the distance north and south of the equator. There's a practice quiz down below if you want to try it. All right, distance, again, is the absolute physical distance. So it comes in two parts. You have absolute and then you have relative measure. Absolute distance, physical distance, is measured in miles, kilometers, depending on what side of the world you are and what country you're in. Relative measure is more in the terms of time and effort and cost. Again, cognitive distance would be the distance that people might be willing to travel to do something. And again, it's more based on personal judgment. So again, it's more of opinion based. All right, distance is a key theme with geography. The first law of geography, at least at one point, was Hilbert's law, that everything is related to everything else. And the nearer things are, the more contact they're going to have with each other. As distance between two points or towns increases, the less interaction they're going to have. So there's two key points to this. One is friction of distance. It's a reflection of time and cost to overcome that distance. The second point is distance decay. So as time goes on, whether it's a phenomenon or people, that as distance increases, the less interaction those two areas are going to have, and the more likelihood that their contact's eventually going to decrease. Geographers often use space to understand how things are arranged on the Earth. For example, they think about how people arrange themselves, how businesses are distributed, where countries are formed, and things like that when they think about space. Space can be measured in absolute, relative, and cognitive terms. Absolute space, again, is that mathematical positioning using latitude and longitude lines. Topographical space, again, is the connections between people, and it can be measured with absolute certainty. Relative space can take the forms of cultural, social, economic. It can be described in more of regions, routes, distribution patterns. So how is population distributed over a certain spot? Where are certain regions with regards to religion or ethnic breakdown, things like that. And then cognitive space are more of landmarks, more mental maps. So how do people perceive themselves in certain areas? How do people treat environments in one area versus another area? And then again, landmarks. What is important to one culture might be different to another culture. So these are how people define space. And this is a mental map of, again, drawing what is important. Again, different people are going to perceive different things differently. Density, distribution, and spatial interaction. Everything occurs in a unique space on Earth. Distribution has three main components: density, concentration, pattern. Density is the frequency something occurs. So arithmetic density is the number of total objects in a given area. For example, population density. Physiological density would be more the number of persons in a given area, for example, like agriculture. So can a country feed itself, for example? Concentration is the feature of how things are spread out over a given space. For example, in a city, you've got clustered where buildings are very clustered together, whereas if going through the farmland coming home from Philly, in Philly, the buildings are clustered together, going through Lancaster and areas like that, you have much more open space. The houses, our farms that we might come across, decreased as we went down the road. And pattern is just the geometric arrangement of objects. For example, in Lancaster 1785, they patterned lands. Again, they mapped it out and sectioned it off so you could see where people would be able to settle as they claimed different tracts of land. All right, density and concentration of baseball teams. So again, as populations shifted and moved throughout the country, you're going to see a shift of baseball teams. So for example, in 1952, you see most of the teams are all clustered from the East Coast to Midwest, but as population has, spread out through the country and we have a large population out in the West, you're going to see those concentrations of where those baseball teams are. Again, a lot in the Northeast, some in the Midwest, and then a large chunk on the West Coast. So that has shown kind of how the concentration density has changed over time. World population density, again, the darker areas, darker colors are going to be your larger areas of population. To show you a contrast in density versus population. So if you look at all the counties in the United States, you can see where you're going to find more larger numbers of people in a given area based on what's colored in. Again, your more open areas where you don't have a lot of color, you're going to have a smaller population density as opposed to in the Northeast. Out in California, you've got certain chunks like where Los Angeles is, where New York City is, you're going to have a larger population density because you have more people squished in a smaller space. Compared to concentration of Christians, again, this is the amount of a group over a certain amount of space. So again, you're thinking about the percentage of people in a given area. So again, this is a little bit different than density. So concentration and density are different. Accessibility. So this is how easy is it for people to interact in a location, whether it's through transportation routes, whether it's through highways or airplane travel, or through natural means like rivers and things like that. So what is it near? And again, connectivity is access to things, whether it's transportation, communication channels, things like that. And accessibility often functions as a key thing for economic and cultural things, but particularly economic is a huge thing for accessibility. More areas that are remote, that are inaccessible, say, for example, areas in Latin America or in Africa, their lives have not been changed that much because of it's harder for them to have access to people because of where their geographic location is. Spatial interaction, again, shorthand for just knowing how human interaction has occurred. You have complementarity, transferability, intervening obstacles, intervening opportunities, and diffusion. So complementarity is that we need each other. Again, spatial interaction occurs between two places, and how does that all work? So one, you're going to have variations in physical environments and resources. So people are going to trade with each other to make up for that. You also have internal divisions of labor. So again, as we talked about before, different countries are going to specialize in different things to balance that out. And then you're going to have specialization, and some countries are going to have larger economies and some are going to have smaller. All right, so transferability is a function of two things. One is the cost of moving one item in real money in real time. So a couple of things. One, if it has a high transferability rate, it's relatively small, easy to handle, and transportation costs are really small. So microchips, maybe a book, plastic toys like Legos, things like that are relatively small. Pens. Low transferability rates are much more larger objects. They might be fragile, and they're going to be lower in value because of their weight. And again, transferability rate is going to vary over time because of changes in communication and things like that. Transferability rates have increased for certain items and decreased for others. So that has changed quite a bit. And space-time compression, so the time that it required to cross the Atlantic or orbit the Earth has changed quite a bit because of technology. It took Columbus 37 days to get from Spain to San Salvador, yet 300 years later, it took John Glenn 5 hours to orbit the Earth 3 times, so things have changed quite a bit. So space-time compression is that the distance over time to travel around the Earth has decreased quite a bit. All right, diffusion is the process in which something is transferred. Obviously, there's a place of origin, and then it can diffuse very quickly through people, through communication means, through internet, through media, all kinds of different ways. Diffusion has a couple of different aspects. You have spatial diffusion. So this is how things have spread over time. And again, it's one of the most important. A lot has to do with interactions. And it's crucial to understand geography and also to understand where people have been over time. Again, these are kind of where the river valley civilizations have started, and then showing where their influence spread as those ideas and those cultures. Relocation diffusion is type of diffusion that's when people actually move from one place to another and they bring the phenomenon with them. So it's again like the Amish moving from Europe over to the United States. That's how their culture spread. Expansion diffusion is more of a snowballing process where things develop in a hearth, they remain stronger, but then they spread. For example, culture, agriculture, religion, things like that. So if you go take your culture and you conquer somebody, then that culture spreads. And there are 3 types of expansion diffusion: hierarchical, contagious, and stimulus. Hierarchical is when, again, we talked about this before, this is more of a review, when an idea starts at a seat of power and then it spreads out. So fashion, music, things like that starts in a major city and then spreads out. Contagious, again, is more something that's rapid, so it's more like with disease. And then stimulus, again, is something starts in an area, but then it changes. For example, Europeans took the idea of growing wheat, but when they came to America, there really wasn't wheat, so they grew corn. So they started preferring corn over wheat, as an example. Economy is obviously diffusion spreads as well with that. For example, we've already talked about this before with world cities. North America, you have New York. Europe, you have London, and then Japan for Tokyo. Those are also world cities, but they're also key economic areas as well. Regions, you have 3 different types. You have formal, functional, perceptual. Regional studies, again, give you a really good idea of just how people have organized themselves and where you kind of find them and how they've adapted their geographical settings, but just also interactions with people. All right, formal regions are more defined. They are homogeneous. They have at least one or more characteristics. They can be cultural, economic, or environmental. For example, Montana is a formal region. It has recognized boundaries. It has a common set of laws. So formal regions tend to be, they could be cultural. So for example, the German area of Europe could be a formal region. The United States is a formal region because it has recognized boundaries, different things like that. A functional region is more of organized around a central place. For example, an economic area. For example, the broadcasting of reach of a news network, or the circulation area of a newspaper, the market area for a business. For example, one of the major league sports teams like the Redskins or the Baltimore Orioles. You see my bias here. As an example, that's more of a functional region. Formal and functional regions also overlap. So the state of Hawaii is a formal region, but in that area you see functional regions such as the different broadcast areas that you will see within that, or the newspaper circulations within the state of Iowa. Perceptual regions are more of a vernacular region where people believe things exist as part of a cultural identity. For the classic example is the South. And here in the United States, based on the food and the language and the culture of the South and the common history varies compared to other places in the United States like the North, or the Midwest as well. And vernacular reasons, there are a number of definitions of what the South is in the United States. Again, going back to sort of the Confederacy, the slave trade, religious, economic. So the South, the connotation of the South has many different characteristics to it, based, as you can see by the map. And regionalization has three different components to it. One, regionalism is when you have different groups, whether it's religious or ethnic, that have a distinct identity, and they live within a formal region's bounds of the country, and those identities tend to butt heads. For example, within the former country of Yugoslavia, you had a lot of regionalism going on between the different ethnic groups, and they had a hard time, living together. That was very difficult. Or even under the former Soviet Union, when you had the regionalism with the different ethnic groups there. Sectionalism goes back to this country prior to the Civil War, where different parts of this country had very strong views about how this country should operate, and that was often called sectionalism when it was in the West or the North or the South. Irredentism is the idea that you have a government of a country that's a minority group outside of it. For example, you have the Serbs who, for example, in Bosnia, who wanted to live and be part of the Serbs in Serbia prior to World War I. That was an example of irredentism. Or, for example, when Yugoslavia broke up, you had Serbs from Croatia who wanted to join with the Serbs in Serbia, or Bosnia, I should say, instead of Serbia, as an example. Again, there's an idea that the world really is not physically flat, but because of communication and transportation these days, the world might be flat because the distance between nations and people are becoming increasingly much smaller. So tonight for homework, make sure that you've listened to this podcast, ready to answer some questions next class, and work on your 5 themes posters, as well as continue working on your chapter presentations for the 4th quarter.